Okay, folks, I see that a lot of people have left on vacation already. I should give a quiz today and make it worth 90% of the grade. What do you think? I'll let you be open book, open notes. I'll put the answers up on the thing. That'll really piss them off no end, right? But I don't think I can do that. That would be unethical, immoral, whatever. A couple of reminders again. I will send you emails today, tomorrow, and Friday. And then I will leave you alone for 7 days. 7 days. And I'll be raring to go. So on next Friday you will get, so at least you get a week away from me. So think of that as your additional blessing on vacation. But a reminder again, when you come back, you'll be a week away, close to a week away from that March 29th, which is when you get that one-time deal. So if you haven't started on your DCF valuation, please do. If you already have started, keep working on it. If you're already done, tweak it, because no valuation is ever quite done. Trust me, numbers will come in, information will come in, you'll rethink this. And think about the story, right? What is it that drives? So don't think of it as a bunch of numbers on an Excel spreadsheet, because then you're not doing valuation. You're just plugging numbers into a spreadsheet. Any questions? Okay, so let's move on. Today we're actually going to, you notice this is what, 13th session of the class. How many companies have actually valued in the class? Not one. I've done a cash flow one company, discount rate for another company, growth rate for a third company. I haven't actually valued, and this was supposed to be a valuation class, right? You're saying, what a waste of 12 sessions. Those 12 sessions are going to be the foundation that's going to allow us to start valuing companies today. So before I start on those valuations, let's look at some things that will come up anytime you do a valuation. First, when you value a publicly traded company, you almost always will come up with a value that's different from the price. That's why we have a valuation class, right? So here's my question. What is your reading of the difference? The first is, you are right and the market is wrong. If you believe this, you have a serious case of hubris. You've got to let it go, right? Because this is going to get into serious trouble if you can. How about you're wrong and the market is right? If you believe this, then I'll tell you what's going to happen to your valuation. It's going to go on a journey. You know what the destination is going to be? The value is going to meet the price. And trust me, for some of you, that's where you're going to end up, because you don't trust yourself enough right now. And it's not your fault. That's going to come over time. So when you get a value of 15, this is especially true if your value is very different from the price. Well, your first reaction is going to be, I must have screwed up. And it's not a bad reaction. But if you let it play out, then the point of valuation disappears. The third is, you're both wrong. Yeah. You think so? Both wrong? That's really a presumption in investing. That we're both wrong, but that you're less wrong than the market. That's what you're hoping and praying for. It's not that you want to be right, you just want to be less wrong than the market. Of course, you can't both be right, because then the numbers can't be different. Or can you? What game are you playing when you do discounted cash flow valuation? You're playing the value game. What's the market playing? The pricing game. It might have the right price given demand and supply. In fact, by definition, if it is the price, it is the right price, because that's a market clearing price. And finally, none of the above, which I think is a cop-out position. My point is, you are going to get a value for your company. It is going to make you uncomfortable if that value is different from the price. Don't let that make you go in and do bad things. Like what? Replace your growth rate with the analyst estimate, because that gives you a better value. Better value in what sense? A value close to the price. Often people define better values. Closer to the price, it must be a better value. It's a very strange definition of value, because there's no point to this class if that's your definition of value. Let's move on. Let's say you valued a bank, and you arrived at a value of $12 per share using a dividend discount model. The regulatory capital guys have woken up to the fact that banks are risky, and they've said, hey, we're going to raise the capital requirements or capital ratios for all banks. How will that affect your value per share? Increase your value, decrease your value, or no change in value? Dividend discount model, right? So this should be no effect, right? Your dividends are your dividends. What does it matter? You think down why? Tell me the mechanism then.
Other firms will now have to pay out dividends, and that might.
Well, let's make it about your firm. When you have to raise capital ratios, how is it affecting your capacity to pay future dividends? Remember the fundamental growth equation? I'll give you a clue. What was the fundamental growth for this dividends going to be over time? Your retention ratio times your return on equity. What have I just done by raising your capital requirements? I've lowered your return on equity. So even though this year's dividend obviously is not changing, I've just lowered your growth potential as a bank, which means even if I use a conventional dividend discount model, my value per share for your company will now be lower than it was before. That's why we spend so much time on these, in the weeds, right? Looking at all these mechanisms, because ultimately the way it feeds into value is going to be through one of those mechanisms. Final question. You value a high growth company. And this is actually very, because lots of people, including VCs, get this wrong. Let's see if we can get this right. You take cash flows to equity, you discount back at the cost of equity. You arrive at a value for equity of 100 million. The company has 10 million shares outstanding today. But remember, it's a high growth company. Those cash flows to equity for the first few years, you needed new capital. So you estimate that this company will need 2.5 million more shares. You'll issue it over the next 10 years. So I have a very simple question. The 100 million is the value of the equity. To get a value per share, do I divide by the 10 million shares outstanding today, by the 12.5 million shares that I think I will have outstanding by the time I get to the 10th year, which gives me a range between 10 and 8. Maybe I should pick a number between the two. Maybe I should be a value greater than 10. I've pretty much given you every possible answer here. What do you think I should do? Should I divide by the actual number of shares today, the expected number of shares? This is actually, many of you valuing young growth companies, this is something that's happening in the background that you're going to wake up and say, what do I do now? And I just want to deal with it now before you actually face that question. What do you think?
The actual number.
The actual number. But my share count going to increase? Why am I ignoring it?
You get more cash. I have a higher value then.
No, your value can't change because it's in the cash flows. Yep.
Because if you issue more shares, assuming that you sell at a given valuation, it won't affect the price per share.
That's true, but I still have more shares. Right? So it's not about giving up value.
But they have to pay for their shares.
Okay, now we're on to something. Why am I issuing shares? Because I like issuing shares? I'm issuing shares because I had negative cash flows to equity, right? So when I did my cash flows, I had negative cash flows in years 1, 2, and 3, and that's why I'm issuing the shares. When I did my present value, those cash flows, those negative cash flows affected my present value by doing what? Bringing it down already. I've already brought in expected dilution. People don't believe it when I say this. And I'm going to show you with young growth companies how it's brought in. When I do my present value, my dilution is already in there, in that present value. I don't have to worry about the fact that Lyft has to issue more shares in the future. In fact, based on my own cash flows, I can promise you Lyft has to issue more shares in the future. But I don't have to worry about it. My present value already reflects that dilution. I can divide by the share count today. So we'll deal with those in more detail as we start to work with companies. But let me go back and tie up the last loose ends I had with options. So is everybody comfortable with the 3 different ways of dealing with options? Somebody remind me again what the 3 ways are. If you have options outstanding, what's a bludgeon approach? What do people do? They change the share count, they adjust for diluted shares, they basically act like options, just change the share count. We said that'll give you too low a value for your shares because you're acting like nothing happens when options get exercised. At the other extreme, we talked about the treasury stock approach. We take the proceeds you get when the options get exercised, add it to the numerator, and divide by the total number of shares. It sounds good until you realize that what they're doing is acting like options have no time premium, that they're worth whatever the exercise value is. That will give you too high a value. This is like Goldilocks. First bowl of porridge was too hot, the second bowl is too cold, the third bowl is just right. So what do you have to do? You have to value the options as options, subtract it from the value of equity, and divide by the actual number of shares. That's going to give you a value between the two extremes, but it's a more realistic value. And today, as I said, this is what you're required to do as companies. You're required to value options as options and show them as expenses. So if I gave you a company today, you could value the equity. I built into my spreadsheet an option pricing model. You can value the existing options. You can subtract it out. You can come up with the value of equity. And you're done, right? There's one catch, though. You're not done issuing options. So if you're a company that consistently uses options, what you've done is counted the options that have already been issued. But to the extent that this company will continue to grant options in the future, you've got to worry about it. So the question is, where in your discounted cash flow valuation you reflect the fact that this company will continue to use options next year, 2 years out, 3 years out, 4 years out, 5 years out, or restricted stock. Lyft, for instance, will continue to issue stock-based compensation for the next 5 or 10 years. But I don't seem to have counted that in my share count. So where do I show it? Think of why companies issue options, right? Let's cut down to basics. We said companies use options because they don't have the cash. It's as simple as that. So if any of you get job offers from Lyft, the number will look really good, but don't go to the bank yet with it, because most of the number will take the form of stock options or restricted stock units, more likely. They use options as compensation. What do we do with the rest of compensation expenses? We show it as a line item. We reduce our revenues by those expenses to come up with operating income. So if I expect you to keep issuing options and restricted stock in the future, what I'm going to do is reduce your future income by that expense, which will give you lower income, lower cash flows, lower value. Which actually brings me to what I think is malpractice in valuation. You know how many analysts and companies add back the stock-based compensation? They claim it's a non-cash expense. Therefore, we're going to report earnings before stock-based compensation, and we're going to compute cash flows. Don't ever do that. You're saying, but it's a non-cash expense. What's wrong with doing that? What am I missing when I add back the stock-based compensation? Is it really a non-cash expense, or did I just skip a step? You know what I mean by skip a step? If I'd taken the same stock or options I gave you, and I'd gone to the market, issued those shares or options, raised the cash and paid you the cash, it would be a cash expense. I just skipped a step. I used the barter system to evade my costs. If you treat all of those expenses as non-cash expenses, I've got a roadway to help pay for you with stock-based compensation, right? Because I'll pay for everything with options and restricted stock. The guy who picks up my garbage, here's an option, you know. And at the end of the year, I'm going to say, look, my revenues are my cash flows. Look, all my expenses were stock-based compensation. Take a look at Lyft's prospectus again. 80% of their expenses last year, 80%, they paid for with stock-based compensation. Which means it's not just employees. They're paying everybody, suppliers, consultants, essentially everybody walks in through the door. I'm not kidding. That UPS guy who delivers stuff there has a bunch of tips in the form of Lyft options. That's why when they talk about giving the drivers $10,000 apiece, which is their plan, my guess is 2/3 of that will be in the form of stock-based compensation. So you cannot just ignore stock-based compensation. I'm going to treat it like any other expense, lower income. So here's how it will play out. When you look at your companies, some companies, most of their stock-based compensation is going to be in the past. So if you're looking at a company that used to be a young growth company but has now made that transition, it's now a growth company, it's making money, it has cash to pay its salaries, most of your problems are in the past. So all you have to do is the first part of what we did, right? Do the equity value, subtract out the value of the options, you're done. If you have a company that's in this ongoing process of having given options in the past and it's continuing, then you have to do both. In the third case, you might have a company that used to never give stock-based compensation and has now decided that it's going to switch to stock-based compensation, in which case there's no deadweight adjustment, but you have to bring in that future option grant or restricted stock grant into your cost. Finally, if you think about where options are given the most, they're the places where your headaches are the greatest. They tend to be, option grades are for effect value more if the strike price is lower. The longer the maturity, the more volatile the stock price. That's basic option pricing dynamics. The kinds of companies that grant options tend to be young, risky companies, which means they're exactly the kind of companies where the time premium on option is going to be an issue, and ignoring it is going to get you into trouble. That's basically all I had about stock-based compensation. Any questions on stock-based compensation? So now we're going to go on a fun journey. So far it's all been about numbers, right? Reinvestment rate, return on capital. But at the start of the class, what did I tell you? Every valuation has a story that you're telling. I asked you that question, right? Are you more naturally a story person or a numbers person? We kind of self-selected. I don't even remember what the breakdown was, but my guess is more of you are numbers people than story people, because that's how you end up at Stern rather than the CAS or wherever else you could have ended up. So there's a selection bias here. I understand it. But there are a few of you who are still story people. Why are you here? Because your parents said you cannot get a history major. I'm not paying tuition for that. You have to go to business school. So your history heart is just bleeding. I wish I was studying history, but this is all you have to do. So one reason or the other you're here. You're either a story person or a numbers person. I said a good valuation is a bridge between stories and numbers. Remember how I described that bridge? When you show me a valuation, I point to a number. I said you've got to have a story that backs a number. And when you tell me a story about a company, I said where's the number that goes with the story? And I said you've got to be able to point to that number. And I said if you don't do that, you're going to wallow in your own delusions. What are those delusions? If you're a number cruncher, that numbers are precise, that you're being objective, and that you're in control because you have a number. And if you're a storyteller, your delusions are that being creative is you can't put a number on it. This is why numbers people are hated in creative places. Right? The finance department in a movie studio is always the most hated place because they're numbers people, we're creative people. They also think the bigger the story is, the bigger the number has to be. I told you a big story has to be worth at least $5 billion, right? Even though it's fantasy land. And finally, they love the power of anecdotal evidence. They're like my mother-in-law. And I don't mean that as a compliment. She comes up with these most outrageous conclusions. And I always fall into the trap of asking her, Judy, how do you come up with this? And I know I shouldn't because she always tells me. And I say, I wish I hadn't asked her that. About 10 years ago, we're sitting at dinner. Out of the blue, she says, the best car to drive in a snowstorm is an old Volkswagen Bug. You've seen the old Volkswagen Bug? It's got a motorcycle engine in the back. It weighs like 250 pounds. You can lift it, carry it around, in your spare time. That's the best. So, as always, I've fallen into the trap. I said, Judy, how do you come up with that? And of course, she told me. She said 22 years prior, and I can see the story coming, too late to stop it. She'd been in Lake Tahoe, driving her Volkswagen Bug back home from the grocery store to the home in the middle of a snowstorm. And 2 other cars had gone off the road. So you wait for the story to be over, and then I said, so? She said, that proves it, right? Amazing sample size of 1, how much you can extrapolate to the rest of the world. Left to our own delusions, we don't even realize the delusions. You end up in a number crunching job, you're surrounded by other number crunchers, you don't notice that you're delusional about this precision thing, you just tell each other, oh, we're so precise. You hang out with a bunch of storytellers, you tell each other anecdotes, you think you've covered the whole world. You're Einstein rolled into that room, right? You create laws of gravity. Basically, you can create all kinds of laws on sample sizes of 1. We have a problem. Business has become homogeneous. Basically, you are almost like tribes. You gather together, you go to the same schools, you read the same books, you're put in the same teams. Okay? That's a different fight for a different day. But in valuation, it's become an issue because valuations are being done by pure number crunchers who can't tell stories. And sometimes they encounter storytellers who don't deal with numbers. It's like 2 tribes. They can't talk the same language. If you ever want to see a conversation that goes nowhere, let a venture capitalist talk to a banker. Venture capitalists tell this big story, and the banker will say 8 times EBITDA. Let me tell you an even bigger story, 8.5 times EBITDA. They can't talk to each other. The language is not there. So I want to give you the language to go across that, because otherwise we're not going to be able to get the valuations going. So I'm going to take you through a 5-step process for converting a story into a number. Right? This is a process I go through religiously, because remember how I describe myself? Number cruncher or storyteller, which came more naturally to me. I was a number cruncher. So left to my own devices, when I want to value companies, guess what I want to do? What are my urges driving me to? Open an Excel spreadsheet, let's start entering numbers. And I've got to stop myself, because if I do that, all is lost. So I've got to do a 5-step process. The process always starts by telling a story. And to tell a story about a company, what's the first thing you need to be able to do? You need to understand what the company does. If you think Cisco makes vegetable oil, I don't care how good you are at discounted cash flow valuation, you're in deep trouble. Incidentally saying, isn't that what Cisco does? No, that's Crisco. Cisco makes networking equipment very different. You can't put it in your omelet, you can't stir fry vegetables with it, don't try. Different company. It's common sense, but if you don't understand what a company does, the business it's in, this is basic common sense. Start by understanding the business. I call it surveying the landscape, a fancy way of saying, hey, step back, look at the business, get an understanding. I'm going to use a company to illustrate this process. The company I'm going to use is Uber in June of 2014, way back in time. And I'm going to use the process. June 30, 2014, I opened up the Wall Street Journal, and there's a story. Here's what the story says. A company called Uber that I'd never heard of. This was 2014, long time. Now, of course, everybody knows who Uber is. Had raised money from venture capital, about $3 billion, and with those venture capitalists priced the company at $17 billion. What's the word that I just used to describe how venture capital price? Venture capital don't value companies, they price the company at $17 billion. Still a big number. And I was surprised. The company I'd never heard of. You take that back. I said I'd never heard of the company. I'd actually seen the word Uber on my credit card statements in the 3 months leading to June 2014. Turned out that my second son was going to college in North Carolina, was using Uber and using my credit card. I don't know how that happened. But to be quite honest, I thought he was taking German language. No umlaut on the U should have kind of given it away, but no. So I was surprised. So I decide to find out what to do, and guess who I called first? I called my son. But he was still sleeping. It's 11:30 in the morning. Why sleeping? He kept college student hours, which meant he went to sleep whenever he felt like it. He woke up when he felt like it. Sometimes he went to classes, sometimes he didn't. So I decided to call my niece, who lived and worked in Chicago, and she had to be awake because she worked. She was technically awake. But she wasn't really there. She was in a foul mood. She said, what do you want? This is how she greets her favorite uncle. I said, have you ever heard of Uber? She said, that's a ride-sharing company. I said, what the hell is a ride-sharing company? Let me tell you something about how I lived in New York. I lived under the ground or in the subway. I didn't even take taxis. I didn't know ride-sharing companies existed. She said, I don't have the time to explain it to you now. Why don't you download the app and find out for yourself? Hangs up the phone. Talk to a mother about this. So I download the app, sitting up in my office, I hit the Uber app. Magical things start to happen on my smartphone. A GPS opens up. And I see a car trying to drive towards me. Why trying? This is New York City. You don't get from point A to point B. You try. You go down one-way street, there's a blockage. So I can see it, and I can see this name George in the car. This has never happened to you in the yellow cab. Fascinated, I watch until he puts up in front. And I run and say, hi, George. He says, where do you want to go? You can enter a destination. I said, no way. Can you drive me around for about 30 minutes? That's some questions to ask. He thought for a moment I was a serial killer, but then he said, you know what? You look small enough that I can take you out. And I started asking him questions. I said, is this an Uber car you're driving? He said, no, this is my car. I said, are you an Uber employee? He said, I'm an independent contractor. I said, why do you do this? He said, I have a regular job. I don't make much money. I already own this car. I pay insurance on it. And this allows me to make a second income. 30 minutes later, he drops me off, offer to pay. He says, you don't have to pay me. What? It's free? He said, no, it's not free. When you download the app, they ask you for a credit card. I said, yes. So what do you do? You charge you. I said, okay, then how do you get paid? He said, they send me 80% of your fare. I remember asking, why 80%? I don't know, that's what the Uber guys are. End of talk, I've never seen him since. At this stage, I could see why Uber did what they did. For connecting cars to customers, they get 20%. This is a sweet business. This left me with one final question. What do customers like about it? I decided to call my son again, this time at a civilized hour. 3:30 in the afternoon, no excuse for sleeping anymore. He'd just woken up. So I decided to put him on the defensive right away. I notice you've been using my credit card to back your ride share. Why do you want to do that? You have a car down in North Carolina you took with you. Why do you need to use Uber to go all over the place? He said, Dad, on Friday nights and Saturday nights, I really like Uber. As a parent, you don't want to follow up on some questions. I kind of got it. But to give you some background, this is a kid who can't even visualize paying a traditional bank. Like, I'm 3. So I said, what do you like about Uber? He said, I can call the car from the bar. I said, that's good. He said, but you must have to wait forever, right? He said, no, you come fast. I said, this costs a lot, right? It's cheaper than a cab. This cost must be filthy, right? Cleaner than a cab. I said, let me get this straight. They come sooner than a cab, they're cheaper than a cab, they're cleaner than a cab. That's when I knew cab service was destined for you. So I knew now why customers, especially people like my son and my niece, were switching. Which left me with one final question. What's so special about Uber? Why couldn't I go down into my basement and start a ride-sharing service? All I need is a big computer and a connecting device, right? And I could think of a couple of things that gave Uber an advantage over me. One was $3 million. That's how much they raised from VCs. I forgot to do that. That's a bit of a disadvantage. The second is, this is a business where if you're first in line and you build up a business, there's a networking vendor. You know what that means? Usually as companies get larger, it gets more difficult to get larger. This is a business as you get larger, it actually gets easier because if you're a new driver who wants to drive for a ride-sharing service, you want to go with the service that has the most customers because that's where you're most likely to make money. And if you're a customer calling the car, you could use the obscure new ride-sharing service or the one that's established, and guess which one will make you wait longer? So I had a sense again of what Uber's advantage. I didn't think they were permanent. I was worried about how they were defend the business, but at least I had a sense. So when I say survey the landscape, I go into Capital IQ and pull up the numbers. In fact, I couldn't have. Why couldn't I have? It was a private business, and even if I had, what would I have found out? That they're very little revenues, losing a lot of money, big deal. There's nothing you will learn by looking at the current financials for a young company because there's nothing there. So after I did my research, you call it that, it was mostly talking to people. I drew a picture. And I find this useful for myself because it's great. Why do drivers prefer? Why do customers? Essentially, it's a picture of what I've learned, so I could frame a story based on the picture. And you could see pretty much everything I've learned about Uber at that point in time to show up in this picture. Second step, I need to tell a story. As you think about doing this, remember, you're not a creative novelist. What that means is don't create characters that wander on, interesting characters, three-headed dog. No, I don't want that. Keep it full. So when you tell a business story, you've got to keep it simple and you want to keep it focused. Let's start with the simple part. You know what you should be telling? I remember about 10 years ago, my oldest son came to me with a reading suggestion. He gave me this book. It's an amazing book. 1,200 pages. It's a Game of Thrones. George R.R. Martin. I take my kids' reading suggestion series. I start reading it. Halfway through the book, I called my son and said, Brian, I'm too old for this. There are hundreds of characters in this book. They wander on, they're good guys, here's my suggestion. If you're telling a business story, don't make it Game of Thrones. You don't have 7 seasons and 70 episodes to tell your story. If you're lucky, maybe 15 minutes. Keep it focused. Second, keep it focused. What's the end game for every business? You need to show me a path to make money. I don't expect you to make money next, but at least tell me, talk about the possibility that you need to make money. Is that too much to ask? You'd be amazed at how many startup founders I've listened to. Usually techniques. Look at my neat app. Look how neat it is. Look how many people are downloading it. About 15 minutes in after he's been telling you how neat the app is, you put up your hand and you say, but how do you plan to make money? It's too early to think about it, but let me tell you how neat the app is and how many people are downloading it. Tell me if you thought about the problem. Keep it simple. So I'm going to try to take my own advice and give you my story for Uber in June of 2014. And for those of you who read my Lift Valuation, this is the place that valuation was formed, because in the last 5 years I've revisited this business over and over. I've learned things along the way. So the story I told you in 2014 was of Uber as an urban car service company. Every word in my story is going to matter in my valuations. When I say urban, I'm already telling you where I see Uber succeed, right? Cities and big towns, as a car service business. That will draw new users into the business, like whom, like my son and my niece who normally are not taking cabs, who take car service. With local networking benefits. Remember I said talk about networking benefits? If Uber becomes the largest ride-sharing company in New York, there's going to be a tipping point at which it becomes a dominant ride-sharing. It's an empty local one. Let's say I fly to Chicago. When I land in Chicago, I no longer care about who the largest ride-sharing company in New York is. I care about the largest ride-sharing company in Chicago. So you know what? In my story, Uber can end up taking New York, Lyft can take Chicago, Didi can take Beijing, Grab can take Kuala Lumpur, and Ola can take Mumbai. You see, guys, when I assign market shares, this is going to tell you what kind of market shares. And finally, I'm going to assume they can keep doing what they do, which is keep 20% of the fair. It's completely arbitrary. Who came up with that number? Travis was probably taking a beer in 2008. Say, what should we give to Travis? How about 80%? It sounds good because he saw the 80 on his bar check or something. 80 sounds good. 80%. Because it's completely arbitrary. But I'm going to assume they can maintain it, and they can continue to not own the cars and not have the drivers. They're independent contractors. That was my June of 2014 story. And for those of you who follow this business, you already see the parts of that story that have come under threat. Okay? New York State last year, I think, was one of the states that ruled that Uber and Lyft drivers are now employees. But in June of 2014, that was the story. So that's my second stop, is I have to tell a story like that. My third stop is I have to make sure I'm not lying to myself. So I have to stop and make sure the story I've told you is not a fairy tale, that it's possible. But then I can't stop there. I have to check to see if it's plausible. And finally, some that I'm playing on what? Possible, plausible, probable. But there are three different checks, one more stringent than the other. Lots of things are possible, a subset are plausible, an even smaller subset are probable. So you can tell your stories. That could happen, but I can't invest in you based on that could happen. If you can show me somebody else has done something like this before, then you've gone from that could happen to somebody else has made it happen, that makes it more plausible. And then you say, I've done this, and this, and tried in this city, and it's worked, then you've gone from possible to plausible to probable. So I always struggled with a way to contrast the two. And about 2 years ago, I think it was October 2017, I was on a Latin American trip where I had 3 stops in 3 days. First day I was in Brazil, Sao Paulo. Second day I was in Santiago, Chile. Third day I was in Lima. And I was doing this session on narrative and numbers, connecting stories to that. And I was getting to this page and said, to ask a question. Every person in the room is going to have an answer. There are 300 Brazilians in the room. And you want to ask a question where everybody in the room is going to have an opinion on that question. What's the topic? Don't pick stocks. Don't pick politics. Pick soccer. Right? Soccer is every Brazilian, no matter how remote, soccer is there, right? is it possible that Brazil will win the World Cup next year? What do you think the answer to that is? Of course it is. We won it 5 times already. We know it. So that was easy. Of course it's possible. Then I said, is it plausible that Brazil will win the World Cup? I asked the question in early 2015. There have been few people there saying, I don't think so. You know why? After 2015, right after they'd been thrashed 7-2 by Germany in the World Cup, that painful episode. But in 2017, they were back to feeling pretty good about themselves. They're number 1 and number 2 ranked in the world. They said, that's plausible. Then I said, is it probable that Brazil will win the World Cup? And then we started. We said, if Neymar plays well, if he doesn't get injured, if he doesn't flop, unflop, flop, unflop, what the Neymar thing does. Then, so you can see possible, plausible, probable, very different tests. Possibly easy, plausible, a little more difficult, probably even more simple. And I said, this worked really well. I'll try it tomorrow in Santiago. I should have done my homework before I did this, but I did not. I fly to Santiago, 100 Chileans in the room. I thought this was, is it possible that Chile will win the World Cup? Grown men in the audience start weeping. I'm not kidding. Fine. So what the hell did I do? It turned out that the week prior, Chile had lost 2-1 to Argentina and been knocked out of World Cup contention. I think one of the prerequisites for winning the World Cup is you actually have to be there. So the answer is no. I'd have the heart, or the reason after that to ask, is it plausible or is it probable? It's not going to happen. You know how many founder startup stories where about 5 minutes of the story, it's like, this is an impossible story. The movie pass story. About 5 minutes in, this is not going anywhere. I'm walking out of here. This is an impossible story. You're going to charge $9.99 for all the movies I want to watch every month, and you're going to pay the theater? No, this is an impossible story. Think of how much money people would have saved. They'd walked out there and said, is it plausible, is it probable? No, it's not plausible or probable, it's impossible. Is it possible, is it plausible, is it probable? So let me take my Uber story and check it out. Okay? But before I do that, let me give you examples of impossible stories, implausible stories, and improbable stories. Let's start with impossible stories. But when you tell me your company is going to grow 6% a year for the next 5 years, your company is great. You tell me it's going to grow for the next 10 years, okay. You tell me it's going to grow at 6% a year forever, we have a problem. Unless you're talking in Indonesian rupiah or Argentine pesos. No company can grow at a fast rate. We did this with the government. This rule is violated out there. You know what's out there, right? Or banking, corporate valuation. You know what fairness means? It's a fig leaf that companies use to cover the fact that they've overpaid in an acquisition. So remember like 3 years ago when when Tesla acquired Solar City, a hopelessly conflicted deal. And here's what? Who's the largest shareholder in Tesla? Elon Musk. Who's the largest shareholder in Solar City? Elon Musk. Who's the CEO of Tesla? Who's the CEO of Solar City? His cousin. They knew they were going to get sued right and left when this deal went through. So they decided to buy some protection. In what form? In the form of fairness opinions. And fairness opinions are offered to bank. So Tesla went and hired Evercore, a boutique investment bank. You know what a boutique investment bank is? It's like a gastropub. If you walk by a gastropub in an airport, don't go in. The gastropub, you buy a burger, they charge you $25. That's what the gastro part of the pub does. It allows them to triple the price. Boutique investment bank, do what investment bank do, they charge 3 times the price. And Solar City hired Lazard, old-time New York investment bank. It was an exchange ratio, so these two investment banks had to show shareholders they were getting a fair deal. So already you can tell it's almost impossible. Because how can both sides? But usually the way bankers dance is that they create synergy and control, and they make it look like that both sides work well. So I expect bankers to do horrendously bad things in fairness opinions because they're trying to do the impossible. So in this case, both investment bank start scanning through the valuations to see how many rooms they broke. So first look at Evercore's valuation of Tesla, because that's a valuable company, value Tesla. You know, I'm going to discounted cash flow valuation, cash flows with a discount rate. So look at their cash flows, we have 5 years of cash flows. And they tell in the footnotes exactly where they got the cash flows. They said, we got the cash flows from the board of directors for Tesla. How this is an opinion affair, I don't know, because he said, where did the board of directors for Tesla get? Turned out that they got it from Goldman Sachs Equity Research. What a tangled web we weave when first we practice, you see, whatever that is, you know what I'm talking about. He said, what's Goldman Sachs going to do? Goldman Sachs is Tesla's named investment bank. You see, why did they use the fairness opinion? Look fair. So you have to keep the perception of fairness by bringing a third investment bank in. But they made sure that the cash flows were coming from Goldman Sachs. So far. So already this is a problematic piece here because the cash flows come from the board. This is really not your valuation. So okay, it's a bank, then I've got a couple of some stuff. Of course the cash flows dropped after year 5. Why? Because that's all they got. So what do you think they did after year 5? They assumed a growth rate forever. You say, what's wrong? Your books all do it. They assumed a growth rate of 6% a year forever. My first reaction is, what currency are you guys working in? Forgot to mention the Argentine pesos, maybe 6% works, but if it's US dollars, which is what they claim to be working in, what would happen if Tesla goes 6%? About 30 years will be the US economy. Let's go globalization. About 50 years will be the global. I can't even visualize a world that's all Tesla all the time. You have to live in your Tesla, eat your Tesla, get healthcare from your Tesla, entertainment from your Tesla. I mean, Elon Musk is a really great guy. He's got a dog mode in the car already. Maybe there'll be an entertainment mode, a food mode, a healthcare mode, I don't know. But then what happens after 50 years? The only thing I can think of is SpaceX plus Tesla. You can see where your mind goes, right? Maybe Tesla send them off into outer space. You found Martians, you sell them Tesla. This is an impossible valuation. It cannot happen. There's nothing to debate here. There's no point in my even looking at the cost of capital. They show me all these neat little calculations they did. I don't care. This is impossible. Here's a second example of an impossible valuation. Anybody here valuing Netflix? No? You're valuing Netflix? No? Fine company to value. Dynamic company, but a company where it's really difficult to get a value that is significant to high price, even close to price. So just like you, like 4 years ago, I get everybody, somebody in the class takes Netflix, right? And like this class, I gave them this one-time offer. Look, this semester you can send me your Excel spreadsheet and I'll take a look at it. So I get this Netflix valuation in my mailbox. And there's a value 4 times higher than the price. So I look at his projections and he's projecting revenues of $600 billion in year 10. So I call him and I say, can you come and talk to me? I have a question about Netflix valuation. He comes in. He's an MBA class. And I said, do you have Netflix? He said, yes. I said, how much do you pay per year? He put out his calculator, seemed to be attached to his about $100 a year. I said, let me ask you a follow-up question. You have $600 billion in revenues in year 10. How many subscribers would Netflix need to have to get 600 billion? Put out his calculator and he said, don't need the damn calculator. 600 divided by 100 is 6 billion subscribers. He said, I don't see where this questioning is going. I said, just hang in there, a couple more questions. I said, what's the population of the world? He said, I don't know, I'll go check Wikipedia. I said, let me save you the trouble, it's about 7 billion. I said, there's something you're not telling me. Maybe there's a law that's been passed that says every man, woman, and child has to have a Netflix account, no share. Right? You can't share across 4 people. Maybe your pet has to have a Netflix account as well. He said, don't be absurd. I said, I'm not the one estimating 600 billion revenues. You are. You know what the answer was? I just took last year's numbers. He said, I took the last year's growth in revenues, and I made my growth rate for the next 10 years. It's amazing what growth rates, compounding in Excel will do to your company. My suggestion is before you turn in your valuations, look at your revenues from year 10 and make sure you're not share has gone beyond that, because then you have a problem. That's impossible. Can you grow by cutting costs? Yeah, we talked about this, right? Efficiency growth. You grow next year, next 5 years I'll grow by cutting costs. Yeah, I can see it. Next 10 years I'm getting a little queasy because how inefficient are you? And then you get your terminal value and you say, I can keep growing by cutting costs. You have a math problem. Because each time you cut costs, your margin improves, right? 70, 20, 25, 30, 80, 90, 91, 97, 98, 103% margins. Now we're talking about impossible territory again. Or a final, very technical impossible. For those of you who do your cash flows by line items, your depreciation of capex will change. Can depreciation in the most recent year exceed capex? Sure. Last year they might have done no capex. Last year depreciation was 100, capex was 200. You're very driven by historical numbers and historical growth. You look at the depreciation growth rate over the last 10 years, it's been 3% a year. Capex growth rate has been 3% a year. You let both these numbers grow 3% a year for the next 10 years. Can depreciation be greater than capex for the next 10 years? Yes, it's difficult, but it's getting closer and closer, no problem. Then you get your terminal value, and you take your year 10 numbers and you make it grow forever. Now you have an impossible valuation. You see what? What do you get to depreciate? It's what you have as capex. If year after year your depreciation is twice capex, I'll tell you what's going to happen. By year 6, there's nothing to depreciate. You're creating magical numbers. Impossible valuations. Implausible valuations can happen, but you've got to tell me a really good reason why. So something is not gelling in the valuation. You come to why that's happening. I'll give you an example. About 2 years ago, I was in Dubai doing a valuation seminar. And I wanted to pick up a leasing company. To be quite honest, there aren't that many leasing companies that fast. So I picked a company called Almarai. It's a Saudi Arabian food processing company with margins about 2.5 to 3 times what a typical Middle Eastern food company is. Isn't that puzzling? How come the margins are so high? You know what it's puzzling, right? Why isn't competition coming? So I threw this question out. This is not a business with huge competitive advantage. How does this company maintain high margins? And somebody in the audience asked me, did you check to see who the largest shareholders in Almarai? And I said I didn't, but I should have. And I took a look at the top 70. The top of the list is somebody's in South. Bought in the Saudi oil family. There's your competitive advantage. Remember the oil family selling borders. You can't come in. This is my company's country. Does that even make sense? Whatever. Basically, there's your competitive advantage. My point was, once I knew that, I could live with the 15%. So if you're doing a valuation, the number just is jarring. Something that doesn't make sense. What you're looking for is there a good reason why that number is what it is. That's why I report industry average margins. In every valuation spreadsheet, I do the industry averages. So, because I don't know whether 23% is a high margin or a low margin, because it depends on the sector you're in. You're an online advertising company, 23% is not. It's a typical margin. You're an automobile company, 23% is an outlandishly high margin. So implausible, I'm looking for a reason in future. I'll give you another example and then we'll move from the implausible. Yeah.
I'm just curious. Let's say if it was 1991, you were trying to value Samsung, and it's 20-something, 30% of the subdivision. So assume if we find a company that, with an assumption that some company is 30% in our.
What's Samsung's? What is the economy that you target when you look at Samsung? Do you target the Korean economy? To me, it's a global company that happens to be headquartered in Korea. So in a sense, it will become a big part of your local economy because local economy was never their market, right? They're a global company.
So if globalization brings into that, let's say can U.S. economy grow at 6%? It surpasses its economy.
Yeah, because the global economy has the constraints. You can't grow at more than 3 or 3.5%. The globe. So if you have really high growth in one part of the globe, guess what? It's got to come at the expense. I know this is depressing. It makes it sound like a zero-sum game, but it is. Some of it is not zero. But once you start to get about 3%, your growth. That's why if you look at the last 15 years, half of all global growth came from China. trade wars. That reflects part of this, because in a sense, wealth is getting reallocated around the world when this happens. So global economy can't go at 6%, right? There are global constraints on how quickly growth can happen. But individual, that's why that's why we know the Chinese economy is going to slow down. Why? Because it is now the second largest economy in the world. When you're the 10th largest, you can have a 10% growth. I don't for a moment believe that the Chinese economy is actually growing. What is the official number? 6% a year? I don't for a moment believe it. Because if it's growing at 6.5, we should all be growing at much lower rates. You can almost do an algebra problem. Say global growth is 3%. Let's work out the growth for the non-China part of the world. You can solve for the China growth. That would be a more reliable growth rate than official numbers. It doesn't mean the Chinese economy has gone bust. It just means it's coming back to us because it is now becoming almost a mature economy. That's what the U.S. can't grow. So when you have a politician say, I can have 5% real growth in the U.S., it cannot happen. There is no conceivable way you can do this unless you drive the rest of the world into depression. I'm not suggesting any plans for any of you, but basically that's the only way you can do it. So implausible valuations. One other example of an implausible valuation. Truth in this class, went to work for the NFL. Yes, I think that's the interview Goldman Sachs and all this. The NFL is going to be so much more fun to work with. That's what he does. He works for the NFL. He sends me a valuation of an NFL team. He says, can you take a look at this valuation? So I look at this valuation. Consistency. Used a reasonable growth. I noticed this is a team that owns its own stadium, and I noticed there's nothing being put back into the stadium. No reinvestment. So I called him and said, hey, everything looks okay, but how come you're not putting money maintaining the stadium? He said, that's very simple. Every time we need our stadium fixed, we go to the city and we threaten them. With what? We're moving to Vegas. We're moving to whatever, San Francisco. And they fix it for us. I said, okay. I get it now. Valuation clause. That's the essence of clause. And then you have improbable valuations. I use what I call a valuation time. On March 29th, I'm going to have 800, all of you turn in your spreadsheets around the same time, around 5 o'clock that day. I'm going to have 800 Excel spreadsheets on the day. And I need to get it back. Otherwise, there's no point to this process. That sounds like a lot of work. You're overestimating what I will bring to your valuation. If you think I'm going to look at a 23% growth rate, no, it should be 21.3% growth. You're assuming things about me that I don't know the growth rate for every company. Here's what I'm going to check for. I'm going to check your growth assumptions. So let's say your assumption. So you have three possibilities. You have high growth, average growth, and low growth. Pick one. So let's say you pick. What do you pick? High growth. Okay. So your revenues go 15% a year for the next 3 years. Then I go and look at the difference between after-tax operating income and free cash flow to the firm. I don't even look at individual line items because I could get lost there. But when I look at the difference, what am I getting? I'm getting a measure of how much you're reinvesting back into the firm, right? Whether it's capex or acquisitions. And if I saw high growth on the top line, what am I expecting to see? I'm probably expecting high reinvestment to go with the high growth. Then I look at your cost of capital. Let's say it's a U.S. company. Remember the median cost of capital for U.S. companies is about 8%. I put up that histogram at 75th, in fact, on my blog, 95th percentile. And I see a cost of capital for a company, high growth, high reinvestment. Should I expect to see a cost of capital less than 8% or more than 8%? I should expect to see a high cost of capital. High, high, high. I'm not saying the valuation is correct, I'm saying it's consistent. Low, low, low. Hey, that's consistent too. High, low, low. You're going to hear from me. In a comment, basically saying, are you sure? You have 15% growth. You don't seem to be reinvesting any money. Am I missing something? Or are you missing something? And maybe you have a really good reason again. I think last year there was somebody valuing Togo, or 2 years ago in a this class, somebody valuing Togo, where high growth, low reinvestment, and a low cost of capital. So he said, you know what's going on? He said, this company has been building its toll roads for the last 15 years. It just opened them last year. The growth is kicking in because more people are coming to the toll roads. There's no reinvestment because the toll roads And these toll roads connect the airports to the city, so they're pretty much the only game in town. So there's not much risk. I said, okay. So I'm not saying if you get a mismatch, it's wrong, but if it's a mismatch, you have a much bigger load on your shoulders to explain why your company can go wrong. So you don't even need me, to be quite honest. You can check this yourself, right? Check your growth, check your reinvestment, check your risk, or check your discount rate, check your cost of capital. And focus on the aggregate numbers, because year one, year two, all of those things can get distracting. Focus on the data. So I took my Uber story and asked myself, if I told a fairy tale, and I was telling a pretty contained story, right? Urban car service company, and guess what? I felt pretty comfortable with that story because in 2014, Uber was already an urban car service company. In contrast, if I told a much bigger story of it being a transportation company, then I have a much bigger challenge because the bigger my story gets, the more onus it is on me to try to explain to you why that story is consistent. I'm now going to take a little tangent. There are stories that I sat down that I call runaway stories. What are runaway stories? They're stories that sound so good you want them to be true. I know you all aspire to be bankers and consultants and finance mavens. But let's say when you graduate, any joint at Tisch School, Tisch and Stern graduate, anybody doing the joint program? No? So let's say even if you don't do the joint program, you graduate and say, I'd like to become a movie producer. So you move across the country to LA, you hang out by the Beverly Hills Hilton, and you listen to people come and pitch ideas. You ready? You're the movie producer. I'm going to come to you with a movie idea. You tell me whether you'd like to make a movie. It's about a 19-year-old who drops out of Stanford. Who does that? What's the acceptance rate at Stanford? -3%? Most selective school in the country. You get in and then you drop out and starts a business. You're saying, big deal, another geek who drops out and starts a tech company. No, this is a 19-year-old woman who drops out and starts a blood testing business. Do you guys like the way the blood testing business is run right now? Let me describe how it works right now. You want to get a blood test, you got to call a lab and make an appointment. They tell you 6:30 a.m. 4 weeks from now. You say, can you give me something more civilized? Do I want 2 years from now if you want that? I'll take you 6:30. Show up at 6:30, they make you wait an hour and a half. Why? Because they can. 8 o'clock, finally they call you in, the door opens and the nurse comes out. She looks like Nurse Ratched. One for over the cuckoo's. So come on in. You go in, and she has 2 buckets next to her. So what are those for? Your blood. You need 2 buckets just in case Dracula shows up. So you extract half your blood, and immediately you crawl back to your car. You get in your car, you drive home. You don't hear from the lab for 4 weeks. You call the lab and say, I came in for a blood test 4 weeks ago. I haven't heard anything back from the lab. They say, well, that's because we don't tell you. We tell your doctor. So you bring the results? No. You got to find out from your doctor. So you go through this process again. You call your doctor 6:30 a.m. 4 weeks from now. You show up, you wait an hour and a half, you walk in, the doctor is sitting behind his desk, obviously reading your blood test. So you come and sit down and says, do you want to know what your blood test said? Of course. So maybe I'll tell you. Maybe I won't. So after toying you with it for about 10 minutes, there's nothing wrong with it. Don't relax too much. Because there's a final piece, a final indignity comes. 6 weeks later, you get a bill in the mail. $1,500 for what? Extracting 2 buckets of your blood and feeding it to Dracula. Come on, don't you want this business to get disrupted? So here's what this 19-year-old who's dropped out of Stanford is planning to do. That sounds so much better than 2 buckets. In a nanotainer. That's better than buckets, right? It sounds more scientific already. She's going to run 32 tests in a couple of hours and email you the results. It's almost like she's in the 21st century. And the whole thing is going to cost only $50. And this is going to revolutionize blood testing around the world. That's kind of social focus. Come on, this sounds like a movie with a heroine, great side benefits. You won't eat. I wish I'd made up the story. The 19-year-old who dropped out of Stanford was called Elizabeth Holmes. company she created was called Theranos. Everything else about the story is absolutely true. 2 drops of blood in an entertainer, 32 tests. And it got everybody excited, including venture capitalists who pushed up the pricing for the company to $9 billion. And not just the venture capitalists. Walgreens announced it's going to have a Theranos lab in every Walgreens. And the Cleveland Clinic, one of the leading healthcare entities in the US, said that they want to bear on it. So if you'd asked me in the middle of 2015 what I thought about Theranos, I'd have said it's a private company, I didn't know much about it. But given the $9 billion pricing, the Cleveland Clinic and the sign of good housekeeping right there, there must be some substance. But let me ask you a question. If you're an investor in a blood testing company, what's the one question you probably would ask before you put your money? It's not a social media company, it's not a fuzzy company, it's a blood testing company, right? I would assume you'd ask, does the blood test work? Fundamental question. I assumed that somebody would have asked that question, but I was wrong. Because in October 2015, a Wall Street Journal reporter decides to ask and answer the question. And actually the answers were in the public domain. The FDA had all the results of, so you went to the FDA and say, no, Theranos is advertising that they can do 32 tests on your blood. Have they been approved for these tests? And the FDA said, no, they've been approved for only one. So how come? Well, the results on the other 31 were too noisy. What's a noisy blood test? I know this is completely in bad taste. It's like going for a leukemia test and the results come back and the doctor says, you know what? You might have leukemia, or you might not. We're not quite sure. Come back again in a couple of years. It's not exactly a satisfying conclusion, right? You don't want blood tests to be noisy, you want them to be precise. So he writes about this in the Wall Street Journal. Theranos, threatens to sue him. Theranos threatens to sue pretty much everybody. Turned out that he was right and they were wrong, and over the next 9 months, the entire company unraveled. By June of 2016, Theranos was worth nothing. Elizabeth Holmes had been banned from the blood testing business for 3 years. And there were people in the company who were going to jail. That book that Wall Street Journal report is now out. If you want to read about how runaway stories can take off and how smart, I mean, some of the people on this VC list were really, Rupert Murdoch was there. Ted Draper, one of the leading VCs of all time, was on that list. You see, so smart people, how come they can do this? And in fact, the blog post right in October 2015, there are 2 questions asked. One is, what's the board of directors at Theranos doing when all of this was happening? And then I took a look at the board and I got the answer. Because my first reaction as I looked at this board was, he's still alive. George Shultz, Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan, a sprightly 92, but 92 years old. In fact, if I were a cynic, I would be convinced that if you were a CEO who did not want any oversight from a board, here's what you should do. Get a bunch of 80 to 90-year-olds, put them on your board, invite them to board meetings. Put a pillow in front of every chair, because you never know. And keep an ambulance backup, just in case. But this is a board of directors. There's nobody here who's going to ask that question. And the second question I asked was a more philosophical. I said, if I'd been sitting in that room in March or April or May of 2015, and Elizabeth Holmes was presenting, would I have had the courage to ask the question, does your blood test work? Now I said, I'm not sure I would. Because she was a hero at that point in time. You remember, she was celebrated. She was in the cover of Vanity Fair and Vogue. No, one of the wealthiest self-made woman billionaire under the age of 30. I mean, if I'd asked that question and the answer doesn't work, I felt like the hunt who shot Bambi's mom. Have you seen Bambi? The movie starts with the mother being killed. I always wondered about the hunt who killed her. That probably was trauma, psychiatric treatment. I mean, there's runaway stories. You feel you don't have questions, you're afraid of the answer. A couple of things about stories and how sometimes delusional stories might be in the macro. You might think you're telling a completely plausible story. But if all of the people who are telling the stories yeah, because 3 venture capitalists would think they picked a winner. So you now have 4 overconfident people in this room looking at the big market. How does this play out? When you project out revenue, growth, cash flows, you're overconfident. So you come up with the value of your company. Remember, this big market, though, is being seen by 150 other clusters just like yours, all over Silicon Valley. And they're all doing what? Gathering together in a room, projecting cash flows, and basing their overconfidence. See what the end game of this is? If I took the values of each of the 150 clusters came up with and added them all up, what am I going to find? Collectively, it's going to be too high. At some point, will reality set in? Yes. And when the correction, because we all ring our fingers and say, oh my God, that was a bubble that burst, the bubbles are so bad. I actually wrote a blog post, what's so wrong about bubbles? People thought I was crazy. Bubbles are not a bug, they're a feature of markets. You know why bubbles exist? Because human beings constantly think they can pull off things that they really cannot. They reach for something. So the question I posed in that particular, that I posed to people in that particular post was, would you want to live in a world run by actuaries? We'd still be in caves. Look, the data's not in yet on this fire thing. We shouldn't leave the cave till we're absolutely sure. Every advance in the history of mankind has come from people essentially trying to do things they cannot. That dot-com boom and bust, did it change the way we live? When was the last time you went into a travel agency? You know there used to be travel agencies. In Fifth Avenue, there were like 4 travel agencies. What are travel agencies? They're these big offices with people behind big terminals. And when you wanted to make a flight reservation, you had to go there. You went in and the travel agent said, where do you want to go to? And she would do the secretive thing behind her. I found you a really great fare at $423. Take it or leave it, next 15 minutes. Would you want a hotel room? I found you a really good hotel room. The end of this package deal, you get out of them $1,000 per hour. We no longer go to travel agencies. Yesterday I was in Amtrak. I didn't have an Amtrak physical ticket. Thank God my phone didn't die. Otherwise I'd been thrown off Amtrak. My ticket was on my phone. Every bubble, no matter how bad its consequences are in the changes the way we live. Social media, for better or worse, changes the way we get our news or entertainment. It is what it is. So here are the consequences. Governments don't like bubbles. And governments that value control like them even less. I remember about 3 years ago, the head of the Singapore Stock Exchange called me when I was in Singapore and said, can I come and talk to you? I said, no. Concerns about the way our exchange is evolving. I said, sure. He said, we'd like to make our exchange more exciting, more dynamic, more trading. And I told him, okay, it's not. He said, well, this is Singapore. It's a great place to live. It's like being in Disneyland. Everything is in control, but you guys hate to lose control. And I said, if you want a market that's dynamic, what do you have to be willing to live with? Its consequences, which means you'll have bubbles, you'll have bursts, you'll have chaos. You don't like chaos. Don't ask me for liquidity in markets and excitement, because that is going to be part of it. That's one of the things that governments are going to have to wrestle with. Is they want the good stuff that comes from markets. But the reality is, when you invite that good stuff, you've got to be willing to live with the fact that sometimes people are going to overprice things. And to me, that's not a problem. It's a feature, not a bug. So I'm not the one who points fingers at you crazy bubblers. I understand that this is part of the price we pay. Let me show you one final picture and we'll end for the. So Tesla, as we talked about, might as well pick on Tesla again. Remember that Stockholm syndrome I talked about? With equity research analysts? Tesla is a particularly bad case of Stockholm syndrome. For a long time, its equity research analysts had completely lost perspective. They thought that their job was to defend Tesla, not to examine. So this is actually from an equity research report on Tesla, about 5 years ago, 2014. Around 2014, at value Tesla on my blog around $150, $160. So I think of myself as an optimist in Tesla. Why an optimist? Because there are something unique about this company. What's unique about the company? Can you name me one other automobile company in the world that announced it's going to have a new car model 4 years from now, hasn't built a prototype, hasn't put an assembly line in, and 400,000 people put $1,500 down today? Could GM pull that off? GM 4 years after it's produced a car, because well, drive the car to my driveway, I don't believe you, then maybe I will give you money for the car. There's something about this company that makes, I mean, if you don't ever go to dinner with a guy who owns a Tesla, you'll be talking for conversation, the Tesla. How neat it is, what it does, dog mode, pig mode, whatever mode you use. So, I put my optimistic hat on, I came to the value 150. This guy came up with the value of $600 per share. What has he done? So basically I pulled up and I opened up the equity research report. First it was 250 pages, which told me already that something fishy was going on. It should never take you 250 pages to value. So I started leafing through the pages, big story, pictures, three-dimensional pictures, four-dimensional pictures, all kinds of neat stuff, nothing to do with the company. And then I get to page 53, and there's a D.C.F. That's what he called it. So I'm going to stay with this terminology. So this is where I live. Take a look at these things. So here's what he was projecting. Tesla in the 12 months leading into this valuation is sold about 24,000 cars. He was projecting that by 15 years from now, that would jump to about 1.1 million. Is that plausible? Sorry, the car business is huge. Right? Toyota sells more cars than that, 2.5 million. So it's plausible. Is it probable? Then you can get into questions about it. But it was a story. I said, okay, you're telling a really big story about that. I think that's good. Then I kept going and I looked at remember I said, look at the difference between the after-tax operating income and the free cash flow. The unlevered cash flow is the free cash flow. I looked at the difference, and if you look at the difference, I'm getting a measure of how much it's reinvesting over the next 15 years. And at least based on this model, there was nothing being reinvested. The sum of the after-tax operating income over the next 15 years and the sum of the free cash flows are pretty close to each other. You see, but there's a capex line item. Remember, there's also a depreciation line item. It's a net out. So you basically got from 25,000 cars to 1.1 million cars. And you're not building any new assembly lines. I think we have a problem. I know the Fremont plant has excess capacity. But even at its very best, you can't produce more than 200,000 cars. I decided to call the analyst. He was in an airport on his way to California. He must be visiting a shrine. It was a Tesla shrine in the sky or some homemade Tesla. So I've been looking at the valuation of some questions. He said, I can't answer those questions. I said, why not? He said, I don't do the numbers. I have a team that works on the numbers. Team did this? Yes. I said, when should I call you? He said, I'll be back in a week. You can call me when the team is around. You can answer the questions. He said, you're not going to write about this in your blog or anything, are you? I said, I'll leave it alone for a week and then I'll start it. So I called him a week later. The entire team has gathered around, 6 people. So the lead analyst comes on and says, look, I don't work with numbers. I said, what do you do? He says, I'm a schmoozer. I schmooze with management, I schmooze with portfolio management. I'm a very good schmoozer. The second in command comes in and says, I too schmooze. I go with that team. The third guy said, I'm the backup schmoozer. One of them can't go, I go instead. I said, who in this team does something other than schmoozing? They all point to this 23-year-old kid. They're high, probably out of step. I'm asking his call. I feel sorry for this kid, so I lead him through the process. He's a smart kid, he gets it. I said, what happened? He said, it slipped my mind. He said, I just took last year's capex and depreciation and did the projections. He said, do you think you have a problem? I said, yes. How they can say we slipped my mind. He said, what should I do? So I gave him a suggestion he did not take. I said, have you ever seen Willy Wonka's chocolate factory? The old one. He said, no. But one of the older analysts had. And I remember seeing that kid when I was a younger, strange person. Now I'm an older, strange person. And I remember coming out of the movie with a question. If you've seen the movie, Willy Wonka chocolates are at every store in the world. But there's only one factory. A very inefficiently laid out factory like a chocolate river running through it. And my question was, how does that factory have the capacity to produce all these chocolates? This is how strange people's mind. And the answer is actually could just leave that out though, because when you do the weights for the beta, you can leave it out. Exactly. Again. Have a good break.